There we go. Good afternoon, good morning, whatever time zone you happen to be on. My name is Keith Palmgren. I am the author and lead instructor of a course for the SANS Institute called SEC 301, The Introduction to Cybersecurity. I'm going to go ahead and kill my video feed here because A, I'm not that good looking, and B, it sometimes does clog up some people's bandwidth. So we'll just go with the single stream here. But um, they asked me to spend some time with you this afternoon, about a half an hour. So we'll be here around 30 minutes or so. They've asked me to spend some time with you discussing how you get into cybersecurity. And because I write a course that's about, introduction to cybersecurity, they felt maybe I was a good choice for doing that. But the thing that a lot of folks struggle with when it comes to getting into cybersecurity is they don't realize that cybersecurity is not an introductory career field. It's not something you would come out of high school and be able to go into, for example, or even out of university necessarily and go directly into cybersecurity. Generally speaking, if you were to look at a typical cybersecurity professional today, prior to their time in cybersecurity, they had some IT background, some information technology background of some kind. There are, of course, exceptions, but generally speaking, especially for the higher end cybersecurity folks today, that's going to be a pretty true statement. When you're dealing with something that would normally, someone spend 5 to 10 years, say, in information technology and then transition over into cybersecurity, well, what if you're trying to follow a different path and not have necessarily the time in IT and so forth? Pretty much the only other avenue would be a course such as the SANS Introduction to Cybersecurity course, something to help you kind of jumpstart that. But a lot of my students that come into this class thinking that because it's introduction and introductory level, that it's going to be a simple cakewalk, if you will. And that simply is not the case. I'm going to be showing you some of the things we cover in there, and you're going to see we're actually going to get quite in depth, because cybersecurity is an in-depth, advanced topic. Notice this is our lowest level security course that is offered by the SANS Institute, which is the SANS Institute. What we teach is cybersecurity. All of our courses are around that. And we teach the most advanced ethical hacking courses in the world and computer forensics courses in the world and so forth. And the way our courses work, each one has a number. SEC 301 is the most basic. SEC 401 is more advanced. SEC 501 is more advanced than that, and so on. Well, notice that SEC 301 is the lowest course number. And the point that I'm making there's not a SEC 101. There's not a SEC 201. Cybersecurity begins at a more advanced level than that. Okay. Now, so that's kind of the first thing you have to know. If you're getting into cybersecurity, you're not getting into the basics and so forth. You are getting into a more advanced and more technical area of security in most cases, okay? You can't work in cybersecurity without being technical. Don't misunderstand me, but that is the exception, not the rule, okay? Now, I'll mention some more about that here in just a few moments, by the way. But when you start looking at a typical SANS instructor type of a deal, as I said, my name is Keith Palmgren. I'm a senior SANS instructor. You might notice I have an awful lot of certifications after my name, 11 certifications total, 5 of them coming from GIAC. I'm going to talk more about GIAC in a moment. I write the course. I also teach 401 and a couple of others actually for SANS now. But when you look at this, I would normally, to introduce the 301, I'm going to kind of take you through what I would normally introduce a classroom full of students to. I would, at this point, take you through my resume and explain that I've 35 years in cybersecurity, United States Air Force, AT&T, executive at Sprint, built and ran their first security program. And now I run my own company doing security consulting. In fact, this morning I was doing some work for a particular client, and it's a good thing I set an alarm, or I would have worked right through this presentation and lost track of time. But it is one thing to be aware of when you're looking at SANS training. If you are going to teach for SANS, if you just teach for SANS, you don't teach for SANS. Every SANS instructor must be a security practitioner first. Teaching is our part-time job. We go out, we do this stuff in the real world, we bring those experiences into the classroom. As one example, just one example of many, I have my own company, et cetera, but one of our instructors, one of our first SANS instructors, actually, Randy Marchani, is also the Chief Security Officer at Virginia Tech, who has an amazing security program. We have instructors with SANS who are teaching for computer forensics. They are detectives and so on in their day job, and they come out every once in a while and teach folks how to do what they do at work. Penetration testers who are doing pen testing, day in, day out, and then come in and teach the skill set. But I gave you my email address already over in the chat room, and you have a standing for life invitation, just as all of the 25,000 plus students that I have taught to through the years. You have a standing for life invitation to send me questions via email as well. Okay, the information is right there for you. But if you were my student coming into a 5-day 301 Introduction to Cybersecurity course, we would have gone through that introduction. I would have, before class, come around and talked to you. And we would start working our way through the information that you would need to cover in a 5-day introductory course. And the first day, we're going to cover what I consider security's cornerstone, because if you look at that list of topics, you are seeing the true cornerstone of cybersecurity. Core principles, which I'm actually going to show you a few of those slides in a moment, but we're going to talk about the core principles of cybersecurity. But also, a course of this nature, there is some chicken and the egg problem. I need to be able to use certain terms that we haven't gotten to in the course yet, so I will go ahead and just throw some basic definitions of those terms out there, be able to use the words, and then eventually we'll get to those terms later, more in-depth discussion of those terms later in the course. It made sense to me that if we were going to spend an entire week talking basically about how to manage our risk, it made sense to open up with a module on risk management. So we will go through that. We will then cover security policy. Now, I did mention a few minutes ago that generally speaking, you need to be fairly technical to work in cybersecurity, but that is not always universally true. I know some very respected cybersecurity folks who are not terribly technical, but they are extremely good at policy, legal issues, things of that nature. But policy is often not everybody's favorite topic. We'll make it not painful. We will explain why it's so vitally important. And then we would wrap out our first day with authentication, authorization, accountability. Now, that would be our least technical day. Some folks get to the end of the first day of 301 and they're kind of like, wow, I'd heard that SANS training was really technical and this hasn't been. Wait till tomorrow, where we will completely change gears and get into computer function and networking. And we will open up with how computers work. What is decimal versus binary versus hexadecimal versus something called ASCII? And you've heard of RAM and you've heard of a hard drive, but no one's ever really explained to you what those terms mean. And what is a gigabyte and a megabyte and a terabyte, and what does all this stuff actually mean? And lab, where we are going to convert those number systems back and forth. And then there are certain topics that you just can't explain a little bit. You have to get into a certain level of detail. And networking happens to be one of those topics. You have to go to a certain level of detail with that, or it just doesn't make any sense. And so we will finish our day, spend the majority, actually the bulk of our day, on networking. And people will sometimes ask, now wait, I thought that this was a cybersecurity class, and yet we're going to spend one whole day of our 5 days on how computers and how networks work. That's exactly correct, and here is why. You see, every exploit, and by this term I mean every method that has ever been invented for attacking a computer, has one thing in common with every other method or exploit that has ever been invented. Every exploit takes something or some things that exist for perfectly valid reasons and misuses them in invalid, malicious ways. Always. And so if you're going to do network operations and basic IT operations, you have to understand how computers and network work so that you can keep them working. If you're going to do cybersecurity, you have to understand how those things work so that you can understand the potential for the invalid misuse. And therefore, we'll spend a day explaining how this stuff is supposed to work. Okay. We then get to our next topic where you simply cannot talk about it, discuss it a little bit. You really have to get to a level of detail. And that particular topic happens to be cryptography. We will get into some real detail on the topic of cryptography. Now, we aren't going to get into the math. A lot of people think that you have to understand math to understand crypto. That is absolutely not true. We're going to focus on the process. In fact, I'll show a few screenshots of a few of my slides from the crypto day, and we just walk through step by step by step by step as we go through these various processes. Okay. And yes, you'll learn why that blue text you see on your slide there actually says welcome to SANS, and exactly how that was encrypted and what the cipher was and the site that was used for it, etc. We spend a full day on crypto. Now, we end up our day with data encrypting protocols. Basically, in other words, we spend the bulk of our day saying this is how cryptography works, and then we finish our day with the protocols and so forth on the internet and in our internal networks that are actually using this encryption. Okay. Now, what we have done, we've gone through our first 3 days with day 1, the Cornerstone, day 2, the computer function and network, and day 3, the crypto, and we lay a foundation. And then on the final 2 days of class, we build on that foundation with cybersecurity technologies parts 1 and 2. There's too many to cover in a single day. But as an example, when we get to wireless security, and I tell you that information moves from a laptop to a wireless access point, I do not have to pause and explain what that means to you because you learned that on networking day. And when I tell you that that is encrypted with a particular algorithm called AES, I don't have to pause and tell you what that means because you learned that on crypto day and so on. And so we continue on with our building of that foundation. And we spend a good amount of time on wireless security. Then we get into the network attacks and malware and anti-malware. And some people have actually, some of my students have actually described day 4 of the class as the scare you day. Because yes, we do go through a lot of the bad things that can happen. I tell you how wireless does not work exactly the way you thought, and why that means certain bad things can happen to you, and how some of the common network attacks are occurring, and how the malware works. And so we do spend a lot of the day talking about bad things. And it wasn't really my intention to write a day about scaring you. I prefer to think of the day as G.I. Joe Day, because G.I. Joe says knowing is half the battle. And when we get to the end of day 4, now you know. When we get to day 5, we start talking about how we try to stop some of those bad things with our network security technologies, compartmentalization, firewall, intrusion detection, content filters, sniffers. The list really does continue on. And then finally wrapping up with browser and web security and system security for hardening, patching, virtual machines, clouds, backups. It's a very full 5 days. When the class runs from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., and when I teach this class, I tell the students that on the 5th day, we will finish at approximately 4:32 p.m. And believe it or not, we usually come within 3 minutes of that. But I've attended many training classes through the years, and when I do, I have to pay out of my own pocket. And it always makes me extremely angry when I pay for 5 days of training and get 4.5 days of training. So when you come to class with us, you're going to get your full amount. But so, that kind of sets up what the days are about. We also, as I mentioned, I don't know if you noticed in those slides, we also have a full set of labs, okay? 9 total labs over 5 days. Almost an entire day of course time is devoted to hands-on. Several labs building better passwords with a utility called the Haystack. It's an amazing little tool. You can use it in your in your awareness training. You can use it to train your family at home how to make better passwords. Crypto by hand, visual crypto, configuring wireless access points, number 7. I love that lab because that's a lab where you can take the steps of that lab home and take you take a wireless access point that is in a typical unsecure state and go through the process of locking it down and making it a far more secure thing. And you can take those steps home and apply them at home and with permission at work, etc. But if you notice, as we move through the labs, the level of complexity builds, and by the time you get to the lab on day 5, firewall building, you build an actual fully functional firewall configuration in an introductory course. I don't think there's another introduction to cybersecurity course ever created that takes the students that far in 5 days. I honestly believe that, okay? But as I say, almost an entire day of our class time devoted to hands-on. Now, that's not everything that you're going to get either. In the back of every day's book, I also give you a series of review questions for each module with the answers printed behind them. You guys are getting a bonus here. This is normally only passed on to my students, but if you go to sec301.com, you will find quizzes, videos. I have videos of me doing all the labs. You notice there you have to log into it. I don't care who goes into that site, to be honest with you. I really don't. I simply don't want Google and Bing to index the site and make it searchable. So the simple way to keep Google and Bing and other search engines out of your site is to put a login portal in front of it, because they can't log in, so they can't index it for searching. So you log into it with student and a password of a simple password. I thought I'd keep it simple. Now I'm going to tell you that sec301.com site, this afternoon I've got some meetings and things. We are completely redesigning. We're rebuilding all the quizzes, rebuilding all the videos, completely redesigning the site. What it looks like today and what it looks like hopefully in the next week or two are going to be two very, very, very different things. The point of this is it's not there's also materials and help and so forth that you can use to after the class to in the evenings or the week following or the month following that you can use to help keep this stuff fresh in your mind and so forth. And that's kind of what the videos and the quizzes and so forth are about. Okay, it's also about helping you get ready for the certification test we'll talk about. One of the first concerns that I ran into when I started teaching the 301 course clear back in 2013 was the number of terms and acronyms in the course. And so I added this slide to explain to people that's not a mistake or an accident. 301, as much as anything, it's a language course. As I mentioned earlier, the higher the course number, the more advanced the class. Sec 301, Sec 401, 501, all the way up into the 700 level courses. But the higher the course number, the more assumptions that are made about prior knowledge, things that you know coming into the course. Well, 301 doesn't make those assumptions, including on terminology. Every term that you see on this slide and more, this is not all of them, we go over every one of those in the class in the 5 days. And every time we mention one of those acronyms or technical terms or whatever, we stop and say, this is what it means. And, even if we've defined it for you 10 times, all you have to do is raise a hand and we'll stop. We'll tell you what it means. We don't make assumptions about prior knowledge in 301. Other more advanced courses will make those assumptions. If you walk into 401, there is an assumption that you already know every acronym on that page. 301, we don't make that assumption at all. Okay. Now, also be aware that a lot of SANS courses have GIAC certification. GIAC is actually a subsidiary of SANS. But each course that has a certification attached to it has its own certification. For example, GISF that you're seeing here is the certification for the 301 course. And when you go to take that test, the questions on that test are directly linked to the SEC 301 Introduction to Cybersecurity course. It is one proctored test. It says here, given at View Testing Centers, I actually need to update this. It's a very recent change. Due to the lockdown and pandemic, they have now rolled out testing from home. And that is I think that happened last week, the week before is when they finally, when they were able to get that rolled out. So very, very recent change. But 75 questions to our limit, et cetera. But the way when I say that the test, the certification is tied to the version of the course, to the course you're taking, I really do mean it, because the way the GIAC certification tests are created, and this is across all courses, not just with 301, a professional question writer person sits down and takes the stack of 6 books total that you receive when you come to the 301 class, and they start going through those books and they find something in there and they say, I can make a question on that, and they make a question on that. And that's where those questions come from. Every question comes from out of those books. Now, and when I do updates, and these courses are updated regularly, minimum once a year and usually 2 or 3 times. And when I do an update, there is a coordination process involving several people to make sure that if I remove something from the class because it's out of date, it also gets removed from the GIAC certification test. If I add something to the class, it's added to the test, etc. Over 1,000 questions in the question pool, and they'll pull the 75 questions out at random for you. But the common misunderstanding when we say that all the questions come from the books, they don't come verbatim. Okay, and a really good example, the morning of day 2 of 301, I would teach you how to convert binary and hexadecimal values. When you get to this 301 certification test for the GISF, I'll just about promise you, you will have to do those conversions. But the examples on the test and the examples in the book are not going to be the same examples. The knowledge of how you do the conversion is in the book, but it won't be identical examples. You won't just be able to, copy and paste, if you will. Okay, but that's what we mean when we say that all the certifications are tied to our courses. Okay, all of the questions come out of the books, but they do not come verbatim. Now, every module of the course would begin this way, where we list out where we are in the particular day. We list out the topics going to be covered in that module. As you can see here, I'm just giving you a feel for what the look and feel of the course here. But we'd go through principle of least privileges, the CIA, and on down the list of topics you're seeing there. Now, as an example of the slides you might be seeing, this is the very first content slide of the course. And we actually spend, depending on the instructor, obviously, every instructor has their own approach. But when I teach the class, for example, I spend between 15 and 20 minutes. Notice the slide's not full of words. The slide is making a point, and it is one of the most important principles in cybersecurity. The principle of least privilege. Everybody can do everything they're supposed to be able to do and nothing more. And we spend 15 or 20 minutes making sure that every student walks out of the door when they're in a class knowing exactly what that means and how to apply it, and how to apply it correctly. From there, if you ever attend any security training, you're going to see confidentiality, integrity, availability, and it will be covered as a triad. Notice the top of the slide I'm pointing out. That's incorrect, because in my 35 years of experience in cybersecurity, I have learned that if you try to apply the CIA as a triad of 3 equal parts, you will fail. That is an unattainable ideal. I actually have an entire hour-long night talk on this topic. But we go through and explain, no, we don't use this as a triad. We use this as a method of prioritization. And I could continue on. Well, I could actually continue on for a full 5 days, but the slides just continue on and on. As you can see, I'm a big believer that pictures tell a whole lot of words. We talk about risk. We talk about authentication with things like biometrics. You're seeing in the corner. When we get to terms like kilobyte, megabyte, terabyte, I actually explain, well, what does a terabyte really mean? Well, it's 916 million pages. It'd take 4,581 pallets of paper to put 1 terabyte of data on paper. What is the difference between hard drive and RAM? When we get to networking in the bottom corner, you're seeing I take you through the steps of networking. That's one slide out of a series of about 10. And so on. As we move into cryptography, what is this? These public keys and private keys. This thing called Diffie-Hellman here in the center. You might be noticing that's a very complex process, and we just walk through all 8 of the steps, step by step by step. Same thing down here with something called hybrid cryptography, step by step, leading you through these very complex processes. And if you notice, there's a touch of math on there, but the math is greatly simplified, and therefore we are focusing on the processes that make this stuff actually work and function and be successful. Because in my experience, if you want to make this stuff in cybersecurity work, you don't have to understand the math behind it. You have to understand the process, the steps that have to occur, and the order the steps have to occur in. And so we're taking you through all of those various steps. When we continue into the cybersecurity technologies parts 1 and 2, again, you might be noticing I'm a big believer in pictures instead of just slides full of words. But, there in the middle, you're seeing us walk through one of the more advanced attacks, the ARP cache poisoning attack, step by step. On the next to it, another very advanced attack that's very common, drive-by download. Bottom corner, you're seeing the why that is my own personal backup solution that you're seeing on that slide, and why I believe that I will never pay ransom. In the middle of the bottom, you're seeing the solution of the Firewall Builder Lab, and if you have done those steps correctly, you'll have that 9-rule fully functional firewall, etc. Again, I am a believer that pictures convey things in a more effective way, especially like the ARP cache builder or the ARP cache poisoner or the drive-by download slides you're seeing there. Those are walked through step by step by step. The slides build step by step. They just all appear automatically. And so in this way, when you walk out of the class at the end of the week, these things are actually clear to you. We also use techniques like this. This is one of the concepts in IT that confuses people. How this thing called an OSI stack, how that actually compares to the TCP/IP stack. Well, that's how. And then when you take that and you want to turn that into a packet, if you notice in the corner, it says these are just 2 ways of envisioning the functions. But when we actually put the functions into practice, we do that with a packet, and we do that by simply reordering and creating the packet in this way. Very, very visual. And again, when you tie this in with the hands-on labs we go through, most people agree that it becomes a pretty effective way to learn the basics of cybersecurity. So I know I went rather quickly. Clearly, if we were in the actual class, we would spend more time on this. I was hoping to actually make it this far a few minutes quicker than I did. I would like to open it up for questions. Obviously, if you have any questions whatsoever, post them in the chat room. And then, of course, also you do have my email, and you're free to email me any questions you may have as well. So I'm trying to find my Zoom chat room here, and it has gotten behind one of my other screens someplace. But are there any questions anywhere? And online moderator as well. Yes, I see a comment over there that in the SEC 401. SEC 401 does cover some of the same material. It covers it in a deeper way. For example, SEC 401 has a module on intrusion detection systems, and SEC 301 has 2 slides. So much deeper coverage, but absolutely some of the terminology is going to be the same. So that somebody's asking, what is the difference between the 301 and the 401? I think that's where I would probably put that difference. Also, do be aware that Sec 401 has 1 day devoted to Windows security and 1 day devoted to Linux security, whereas 301 is more cybersecurity in general instead of focusing on the operating systems. We talked about those operating systems, but only very briefly. So how useful will this be for a freshly graduated cybersecurity student? Depends on what you learned in your college. I have to be honest, I hope I don't offend anybody here, but I've seen some people come out of college programs not knowing what they need to know for the real world. As an example, I did have one gentleman who had just received their master's in cybersecurity and had never heard of hexadecimal. I have no idea how that can be possible, but it's true. But so how much help any course will be to you is going to depend on what you know when you walk in the door. So the difference with the CISSP training, well, first off, CISSP, and understand, I used to work for Mike Corby, who is the creator of the CISSP. He's a good friend of mine, so I'm not bashing Mike. But the CISSP is very managerial in nature. It's technical management, but it's much more managerial, whereas this is more of how you do security on a day-to-day basis. And also, CISSP, the questions are notoriously bad, and anyone who's ever taken the test would agree with what I just said. We do cover some of the same information, and 301 and 401 would help you to prepare for CISSP. I'm not questioning that at all. But the other difference is they really don't take things off the CISP very often. The last time I looked at it, it's been some years, but the last time I looked at the CISP, they were still talking about, for example, coax networks, and I haven't seen a coax network since about 1997. And I'm not trying to bash CISP. I hold the CISP. I've held that since 1998. I'm proud that I hold the certification, but I'm giving an honest answer to a question. And if I missed your question, I apologize. I'm skimming back through and I don't see any others. All right. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your time very much. And I hope you really enjoy your Cyber Exchange conference. And thank you so much for your time.